What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some of my favorite boss fights in Baldur's Gate 3. As the game's been out for a little while and people have started finishing the game for the first time, I thought it would be fun to talk about some of my favorite moments, starting with some of the really epic boss fights I enjoyed. That said, of course, there will be a few spoilers here, at least contextually, and while I'm not going to go over specific plot points or anything, it is worth mentioning that if you want all of them to be a surprise, maybe you should watch this later. But that said, Baldur's Gate 3 has a plethora of really interesting boss fights, and while none of them are really mind-blowing in terms of their mechanics, there are some that are really satisfying to fight for one reason or another, which is why I'm making this list. With that in mind though, let's dive right into it with the first one you would likely run into, which has been available since early access, which is the Spectator fight in the Underdark. A Spectator is a variant of a Beholder, and to me, Beholders and their variants are some of the iconic enemies that you can fight in Dungeons & Dragons, being essentially a floating sphere with a giant central eye and many eye stalks that all have their own magical abilities associated with them. They can be particularly deadly foes, and the Spectator fight in the Underdark is no exception if you are unprepared for it, as you will walk up on a field of petrified statues before this thing jumps out at you, surprises you, starts laying down AoEs, unpetrifying some of the enemies and turning them against you. And the first time you run into this thing, it can be a pretty intense fight, but as with everything, once you know what you're doing and can prepare for it, it's not so bad, as you can actually break concentration on the mind control going on here and have some of the petrified enemies wind up helping you, and some really strong builds can just delete this thing even on the higher difficulties. But overall, I just really love this because, again, Beholders and their variants are just iconic D&D enemies to me, and fighting them is always a pleasure unto itself. That said, in a somewhat similar area, a ways away in the Underdark within the area known as Grym Forge, we can fight the Forge Master, an optional boss that you'll have to fight if you want to make use of the Adamantine Forge. And this boss is interesting for a variety of reasons. For starters, it's immune to most damage initially. You have to turn on a lava flow into the forge to superheat the golem, at which point it becomes susceptible to certain amounts of damage, bludgeoning in particular, but it attacks whoever hit it last, and you can use this to lure it under the large hammer in the center of the arena and hit it for a significant amount of damage. And while that's not necessary to kill it, you can just sort of stack bludgeoning damage while it's superheated, and there's even an achievement for doing so. I have a lot of fun with this one because of the mechanics of the fight. It's a little different than basically everything else the game has going on, and it's a fight that if you're unprepared for can take you a reload or two to figure out exactly how to approach it, but the reward for doing so is the chance to create a couple of adamantine armors or weapons, which can be really strong at the time you're likely to pick them up, which can make them a lot of fun to use. So it's a cool boss fight with a very cool reward, and that's enough to put it onto this list. But moving forward are where things get much more spoilery as we start talking about Act 2 and Act 3. My favorite boss fight from Act 2 is actually the last one for that act, which is part of the marketing material technically, but we have Ketheric Thorm, the main antagonist of Act 2, who is raising an army for the Absolute. Obviously, we wind up fighting this guy, but there are so many things I really love about this fight. The beginning of that is how you even get here, because there are so many ways you can arrive at this fight, and the context and the situation will change, which means there's so many different ways this can play out. It's possible to have a fight with this guy on top of a tower, only to have to fight him again later. It's possible to talk him out of a fight, which lets you skip a stage of this. Playing along with their plans lets you skip a stage, while at the same time giving you completely unique cinematics in both cases, depending on the fate of two characters that you will have come into contact with as part of this act. The later phases can play out very differently, before finally culminating in a fight against an avatar of Merkel, one of the Dead Three, which was just this incredibly cinematic, epic moment that was incredibly satisfying. But having played through the game a couple of times and even reloaded scenarios on this fight to see what would happen, it's so satisfying to both fight this fight, but also experience all the ways you can even arrive at this moment to begin with, which is why it is on this list. But moving on from there, we of course have number 4, And this one I want to say as little as possible about, story-wise, but it is an undead dragon in the last act of the game known as Ansur. Technically an optional fight hidden behind a few simple puzzles that a particular quest will lead you to. This undead dragon can give us a variety of answers about some surprising information in regards to a few different people, but more than anything, the fight itself is just really cool. After all, the game is called Dungeons and Dragons, so we should be fighting a few dragons at some point. And this is one of those potential fights. This seems to be a storm dragon of sorts though, and has a lot of lightning-based abilities and some elementals to fight alongside it. And if that wasn't enough, a couple turns into this fight, it will fly up in the air and start charging a powerful ability, and if you fail to move out of the way in time, it will drop to the ground, dealing hundreds of damage to the people around it, which can, in some cases, just wipe out your party altogether. So it's an interesting, fun fight against a very memorable enemy, which then leads to very memorable story moments. So naturally, it is on this list. That brings us to our final entry, which I can definitively say is indeed my favorite boss fight in this game, and this is with none other than Orin. Another boss that was part of the marketing material leading up to the game. Orin is a shapeshifter turned serial killer who worships the god of murder, Baal. As such, she is the kind of person with a few screws loose, which makes for a really interesting villain, but she taunts and harasses you all the way up to the fight with her, a fight in which, no matter how you approach it, which can be one of a few different ways, sees Orin turning into the Slayer, one of the manifestations of Baal's power. And in one variation of this fight, you'll have to fight off many of her cultists at the same time. Another variation sees you going toe-to-toe with her one-on-one as her Slayer form, and both the build-up to this fight and the transformation into the Slayer itself, which was a big part of the first two games, leads to this really cool moment where it finally feels like everything is connected story-wise. And while I won't go into specifics on those plot beats, it was a really satisfying moment to come to the conclusion of this fight. And honestly, one of the more rewarding moments of the game for me personally, which is why it is at the top of the list here. But that is going to do it for today's video. There have been 5 of my favorite bosses in Baldur's Gate 3. I certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know down below what some of your favorite fights are, or just what you're enjoying about the game in general, as I would love to hear it. That's all for me. Thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.